This is going our little scene one right now. Okay, everyone.
I told a philosophy professor today that one, I'm not a philosopher, and two, that maybe numbers aren't an objective measurement system, and that all the skepticism that arrives with hypothetical mathematical scenarios is actually just a reflection of man's inability to find reality.
If you're not a lover of wisdom, what drives your skepticism?
Skepticism drives my skepticism. As long as I'm addressing discordance between my realities and others, I'll be satisfied with my role. Maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe I can be the skeptic and you the wise. Either way, both are necessary or even the same thing. Ha! Maybe you guys are inventing the problems down there in the philosophy department. We're just sitting around thinking of ways we can address them, not even solve them. Then it's the politicians' turn to complicate things. Either way, it would seem that everyone's role is to fuck up our potential to have perfectly simple and happy lives. But maybe we sacrifice happiness for satisfaction. And maybe, in turn, we might produce happiness. Human beings are infinitely folding on themselves. Ain't it grand?
Haha, how much trouble could we possibly stir up in philosophy? Sometimes it seems that we would be happier if we didn't think so much, but I'm not a fan of telling people how to think.
I don't believe it to be good to live in ignorance, even if it would make us happier. I'm no hedonist.
What's wrong with hedonism?
I don't believe pleasure to be the only intrinsic good. Good and pleasure are not synonymous. Just because happiness oftentimes accompanies good acts doesn't mean that the two are mutually interchangeable. I believe happiness comes from good, but is not goodness in itself. Good acts come prior to happiness. Oftentimes what is good isn't what yields pleasure, such as ethical principles and duties that people should live by. With hedonism, the claim is often put, the proper value is whatever gives you pleasure. Which is the same thing as saying that the right value is whatever you happen to value.
With an ethical theory that relative, there is no good.
You could justify evil as good. If so-and-so likes littering, then it's good. In addition, if one were to follow their drive for pleasure, they could easily end up overindulging into excess.
A person can easily be misled down a false path of happiness.
When nothing really lies at the end. Due to so many counterexamples of the argument of hedonism as an ethical system, the premises can remain true and the conclusion be false. It is an invalid argument as far as I'm concerned. Born and raised utilitarian, and its ways are difficult to escape, but I value higher instead of Kant's ethical theory, the categorical and hypothetical imperatives. With his overwhelming epistemology that it rests on, the theory is powerful. With this theory, you can act by maxims that can be universalized. So basically, before committing an act, you consider the principle of your act.
Then you ask, should this be universal law? Should all people use people as a means to an end? Another example might be, should all people deceive others? Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as the means to an end, but always at the same time as an end.
Immanuel Kant, the groundwork of the metaphysic of morals.
As a means to an end.
As a means to an end. In a way, you act as though you are all of humanity. There is no weighing the pros and cons. This theory makes no reference to consequences. These maxims, when reached, are categorical in their message and morally imperative once known. It would truly be a beautiful world if all would follow categorical imperatives, maxims of goodness. These maxims, I would argue, are superior to mere feelings because emotions are relative, subjective, unreasonable. Happiness is obviously something that I do value, but I consider it a consequence of good, but not goodness in itself. If you act well, happiness will follow.
It's funny, because I agree with just about everything you say, and yet I view myself as a neo-perennialist somewhat, and mostly a harmless hedonist. In fact, for the last 4 years, I've used Kant's means to an end philosophy as the primary philosophy to drive my actions and make my decisions by. Evil acts can cause happiness to the one doing the action and to the one receiving it by creating reactions which potentially lead to something positive, which would not have been accessible without the evil event occurring. A recent event in my life, which I initially viewed as hurtful and selfish on the part of someone else, actually made my life much better after subsequent events which would not have happened without the catalyst of the negative event. It definitely wasn't the intention of the person who offended me to make me happy. However, because we live in a world in which a concept of time exists, good and bad cannot be measured so clearly in black and white, only in a single moment. But life is not a single moment. Good and bad are relative and subjective, but not completely. I think the best definition of good would be that which causes pleasure and does not cause pain. And that is only for the moment, but for all time. It can not only cause pleasure for 1 second, then displeasure for eternity. So, cutting a tumor off someone's face against their will might be considered bad at first, but you would be extending their life, which would be good. Where does your absolute idea of right and wrong come from? God? To have an absolute sense of right and wrong, you'd either need faith, religious or otherwise, or an view of all human history. So you could see the impact of every good and bad action to determine whether the end result of that action could actually be accurately measured as good or bad. The only being who could possibly do this right now would be God. Helping feed the hungry is believed to be a good thing. So, say I feed a hungry person. That person lives to see another day. However, the next day, that person activates a cataclysmic event which causes the world to explode, killing everyone. Feeding the hungry in that case would have been wrong, because I aided the destruction of every living thing. Of course, I did it in ignorance, but that doesn't mean people didn't suffer negative consequences. Hedonism without using people as means to an end is more common than you believe. And hedonists don't have to be such simpletons that their lives consist of taking drugs, acting impulsively, and ignoring consequences. It could be, I am going to help people in need because that is pleasant to me. Or, am I going to resist doing this pleasurable thing because resisting it, for whatever reason, will yield another form of pleasure? Nowhere in the philosophy of hedonism say that you have to be a bad person or act rashly, and hedonists can think much farther into the future than you give them credit for. Look up Epicureanism, another form of hedonism. Pleasure is not a negative thing, and it is not simple. Hedonists do not necessarily have to be completely selfish beings who disregard all other people's rights and feelings. I think you're referring to libertines, although they do not have to hurt others either, while they typically do indirectly because they are completely morally unrestrained, or almost. What goal do you have for your life, and why would it be any better than my goal of seeking joyous contentment? In fact, wouldn't whatever goal you seek to achieve make you content or feel pleased? Even if you did things just to be a good person, at a great sacrifice to your happiness and pleasure, that in itself pleases you enough to do it. That is the quest of the hedonist, pleasure and contentment in life. And it doesn't have to come at the price of other people's pleasure and contentment.
Haha, Matt, I didn't know you were an Ayn Rand fan. But here, allow me to present the less wholesome view, as I am the woman. Man is an empty vessel. Whatever you fill with it, it will contain.
Good and evil are merely vague descriptions we've attempted to place on characteristics known to bring benefits and disadvantages on the community. People may develop moral expectations on a global level despite their religious, political, or ethical preferences,
Simply because there are natural patterns in social behavior, society, determining these standards. Like, civilizations must ensure security of certain rights to function. For example, many communities prioritize the preservation of life, or at least the life within their authority. Because each citizen is a resource,
Hence, murder becomes the superlative form of evil. But when taken out of context, it becomes perfectly acceptable. War, a rational way to market murder.
If you give anything a patriotic spin, it becomes not only moral, but heroic, no longer condemned, but honored. Today, our interpretation of the world may be warped by the infinite range of information, opinionated, biased, information on the net, channels, blah. Even ridiculous jokes regarding political issues on Family Guy manipulate the viewer into consuming their ideals, whether that was the intent of the producer or not. So who's to say what is truly good and evil in our modern world? The lines between what is right and wrong will always be obscure. According to Hitler, certain books, particular ones opposing Nazi idealism, were considered evil, and there was a need to purify German literature.
Hitler made it a priority to remain a single source of influence.
American youth today has Family Guy to develop apathetic political beliefs.
However, in the 1930s, the German youth had a political dictator who had a passion for words and spoke with ferocity. So fucking influential that thousands of students, soldiers, and residents participated in the largest book burning ever. So, are books evil?
Because in the 1930s, more than 20,000 volumes were considered to be just that.
I wonder how many people believe books to be an outlet for evil when there are now deep-fried Oreos and double-sided dildos. So, it would seem that good and evil can't exist on their own. One can't be defined without the comparison to the other. Our current cultural perspective on morality has drastically evolved from that of the Middle Ages, when the Catholic Church demanded obedience, repentance, loyalty, and traditional values. According to the Catholic Church in the 13th century, specific organizations, royalty, wealthy members of society, whatever, could contribute a certain amount of money to the church donation in order to be patroned for their sins and or pay for a reduction sentence in purgatory.
Mr. Pope!
During this time, deemed these Christian patrons good and wholesome for investing in their redemption and often signed documents absorbing them of their sins. Even though we reflect on these moments of history with what we deem as the educated view, we are merely armed with a single perspective.
This generation didn't come from a German depression or a religiously imposed society.
We're simply unequipped with the reality of those events. Not to say that we can't learn from lessons from history, just that you can't domesticate an animal who created domestication. Right, wrong, or indifferent, morality exists as a variable, subject to change, with political, economical, ethical, religious, and situational uncertainty.
Identifying these qualities may be easier for some and non-existent for others, but it's all a matter of perspective and persuasion.
Bhagavatam claims good and evil of the world of duality are unreal and spoken of by words and exist only in the mind. This religious theory perceives things as either creation or destruction, as opposed to good and evil.
Both seen as essential elements for balanced existence. I believe this understanding of wrong and right relies on their relationship to one another. So, how should you act? How do you be a good person? It would seem that the wisest way to dictate your actions would be according to a universal truth, a made-up word I'm using to communicate an idea. Truth for me, however, meaning calculated from all possible points of reflection of all things in order to make the best, most possible, logical, considered, righteous decision which exists within a hypothetical realm unobtainable by a single human lens.
Fuck it. The equation is so infinite and circumstantial. Shit, Emily was reading a book the other day that suggests that maybe the only reason human beings even exist is because we produce plastic, which the world can't produce itself.
I told you. Believe that everything a person does is because it pleases them in some way. However, I don't believe it's a negative thing, nor that it is a positive thing. And maybe that isn't even true. My idea of self-motivating factors may be too broad to apply to all. I think that is just how it is. Also believes the reality we sense is the only reality there is and nothing more. That we are in direct contact with reality through our senses. Pity the fool! Not believing there may be more to reality than meets the eye. There may be more senses than 5, senses we do not have. And also, her philosophy completely denies the possibility of a god or gods, or any force which we cannot sense as human beings. I think she is too narrow-minded for me. Plus, she believes capitalism, a system which relies upon imbalance, to be the absolute best. Ha! Read the intellectual impact portion of her wiki. http://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/objectivism_%28ain_rand%29. Thankfully, she is dead and can no longer speak or write.
Dudes always hate Ayn Rand for some reason. So it would seem. Yeah, she might not fit you like a glove, but if she were a glove that happens to be too small, at least that glove would be constructed and woven like a musical composition. And if not, I would still pick it up off the street and mail it to Zach.
Matt!
I think your examples are inconsistent with your definition of good and bad. You define good and bad as being exclusive from one another. Good being that which causes pleasure and does not cause pain, and bad being that which causes pain and does not cause pleasure. By these definitions, you can't say anything is good that causes any degree of pain, and anything bad that causes the least degree of pleasure. Your example of the tumor, for instance, there would be an immediate period during the time of the surgery where the patient would be subject to pain. Undergoing surgery and the entire recovery process, I'm sure, isn't very pleasurable. Your point, I believe, is that pleasure would outweigh the pain in the end. But by your definition of good, this is impossible, considering that the event caused pain as well as pleasure. Does absolute good have to come from God?
No!
Kant's good is a priori and comes from pure reason alone. His categorical imperative is deontological and does not require any insight into the consequences of any action. There is no process of weighing the pros and cons. To undergo the process of John Stuart Mill's hedonistic calculus isn't nearly as practical as the categorical imperative. Like you said, you would need a view of all human history so you could see the impact of every good and bad action to determine whether or not the result of that action would actually be accurately measured as good or bad. To see out the utilitarian approach to its fullest extent, I think, is impossible, because one cannot see all the future of consequent events that will come from a single action.
Your point seems to contradict your position! It seems like you're describing the difficulties of calculating the hedonistic values of pleasure and pain as consequences of one's own actions, and yes, it is extremely difficult.
Because, like you said, something may not begin to yield pleasurable outcomes for some time.
During the time of contemplation on how to act, you wouldn't be able to see all the pleasurable outcomes that lie in the future. And certainly in your example, that person did not intend to yield pleasure for you, but did in the end because they were not able to see the future, as Bentham and Mill's theory requires you to do.
Another point to consider is intent. I think that Kant would argue that intent is very valuable, whereas utilitarianism wouldn't really consider it.
I never said that hedonists had to act as egoists by necessity. That would be ridiculous!
I was simply saying that hedonistic theories can easily lead you into false good, because you can justify just about anything just as long as the pleasures outweigh the pains. It would be fallacious to assume that just because it's possible means that it's true in every case. Your quest to the hedonist, it doesn't have to come at the expense of others, or it shouldn't. I think there's a major distinction to be made there. Mr. Pope! I actually don't know anything about Ayn Rand, but I do know that I see countless gloves on the ground and think of you.
The piano in the sky will crush us all if we look up at it. If not, it will remain suspended above us for the rest of always. Shall we not try to judge each other for trying to catch glimpses from the reflections off our shoes, or trying to determine who's more shiny?